The coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered on the kitchen floor. My father's voice boomed across the room, rattling the air. "What did you do, Emma?" Before we dive in, leave a comment below and tell us, what would you do in this moment? Be real, we read every single comment. Let's get started. I didn't budge, I didn't cry. I stood tall, my hand resting lightly on my barely there baby bump. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice steady, unshaken. The silence that followed was suffocating. My mother, Lorraine, froze halfway down the stairs, her face drained of color. Her hands, still damp from folding clothes, shook. "You're only 18. Are you out of your mind?" My father stepped closer, his jaw so tight the veins in his neck looked ready to pop. "Who's the guy? Some deadbeat? Some rando from a dive bar?" His breath was heavy, like my words had sucked the air out of him. "His name doesn't matter," I replied, keeping my tone even. "What matters is I love my child and I'm keeping it." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You've ruined your life, Emma. We gave you everything, a home, a future, a college fund, and you tossed it all for this." My chest tightened, but I didn't waver. "I didn't toss anything. You're just mad you can't control me anymore." That pushed him over the edge. "Get out," he roared. "Pack your stuff. You want to play grown-up? Fine, live like one." I glanced at my mother, hoping for a moment she'd stand up for me. But she just shook her head, muttering, "You're such a letdown," like I'd committed a crime. And that was that. They didn't ask who the father was. They didn't ask if I had help. They didn't even ask if I was okay. They just threw me out. They didn't know I'd already signed a lease for a tiny studio apartment across town. They didn't know I had a job, and they definitely didn't know the father wasn't some lowlife. He was someone they'd never believe, even if I'd told them. I left with just a duffel bag and a fire in my gut. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I smiled because I knew something they didn't. 15 years later, when they stood in my driveway, meeting their grandson for the first time, they'd finally see what they'd thrown away. And when they learned who I'd become, their faces would turn ashen. That first night in my new place was freezing. No heat, no furniture, just a used mattress on the floor and a cracked window that whistled with every gust. I sat there with a can of soup and a phone that never rang. No texts from friends. Not even a word from my mom. I wasn't surprised. I was the disgrace, the daughter who'd wrecked her life. But I wasn't broken, not yet, because I had my baby, and I had a job. 3 weeks before the blowout, I'd quietly taken a receptionist gig at a private medical clinic just outside Raleigh. The pay was modest, but the doctor who hired me, Dr. Weston, treated me like a human. He didn't care that I was 18 or pregnant. He just said, "Work hard and you've got a spot here." So I showed up every morning at 6:30 a.m. and stayed late. My belly grew and so did my determination. No handouts. No sympathy. At night, I took free online courses, accounting, business law, economics, anything I could find. I wasn't just going to scrape by. I was going to become someone they'd never expect. I stopped checking my old social media. Seeing my cousin Sierra's graduation photos with my mom liking every post stung more than I let on. I blocked it all out. At 7 months pregnant, I was juggling the clinic job during the day and a call center gig at night. One day, I collapsed outside a bus stop. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept. I was barely 20 and I was sinking. Dr. Weston found me shivering, crying quietly, clutching my stomach. He called a nurse, canceled his appointments, and sat with me. "You okay, Emma?" "No," I whispered, "but I will be." He didn't pry. He just nodded and handed me a letter of recommendation. "Give this to my sister," he said. "She runs the finance office at Harrington Medical's headquarters." I stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" He smiled. "Because you remind me of someone I once gave up on. I don't make that mistake again." That moment changed everything. 2 months later, I gave birth to my son, Landon. Holding him, I sobbed harder than ever, not from fear or loneliness, but because this beautiful boy with his bright eyes and tiny hands made every struggle worth it. From that day, I vowed he'd never feel unwanted, not like I had. What followed was years of sacrifice, hunger, exhaustion, and a plan. If they thought I'd vanish, they had no clue who I was becoming. I didn't have a guidebook, just a baby boy, a part-time job, and a fierce drive they never saw coming. Landon was 2 months old when I started working nights again, remotely, handling reports and billing for Harrington Medical's finance office. Dr. Weston's sister, Evelyn, gave me a chance. She didn't hand me a fancy title or unearned pay. She just said, "Don't miss deadlines, don't make excuses, and don't wait for a savior." I didn't. I breastfed Landon between midnight spreadsheets, took weekend data entry jobs, and taught myself budgeting, auditing, and contract writing. I started dressing differently for the office, thrifted blazers, low heels, quiet confidence. People stopped seeing a teenage screw-up. They saw a woman with purpose. By Landon's second birthday, we'd moved into a small townhouse near Chapel Hill. It wasn't lavish, but it was ours, clean floors, a tiny yard, a home no one could take away. I framed a photo of Landon's first birthday and hung it by the door. It reminded me why I kept going. My parents, radio silence. No calls, no letters, no effort to see if I was alive. Through gossip and holiday emails from my aunt, I knew their lives marched on like I'd never existed. My cousin got into Duke. My brother married a corporate attorney. Every family post looked perfect, polished, proud. My name was never mentioned. I was a forgotten page. Until one day, the page turned itself. I was 26, sitting in a meeting with Evelyn and 2 Harrington executives when she slid a folder across the table. "We're starting a new division," she said. "You've been in the background long enough, Emma. It's time to step up." I blinked. "Step up how?" She smiled. "You're promoted head of operations, starting salary. $138,000, full benefits, leading a team of 12. Landon can use the office daycare." I covered my mouth, staring at the offer. I couldn't speak. "You've earned this," she said, leaning in. "And don't even think about saying no. We need you, and so does Landon." I left that office, called Landon's school to pick him up early, and drove straight there. He was 8 with wild brown curls and sharp green eyes, the same smile that got me through endless nights. "Where are we going?" he asked, buckling up. "Home," I said, grinning. "Our new home." That night I signed a lease for a house in the historic district. 3 bedrooms, high ceilings, a backyard garden. I paid cash, no loan, but I wasn't done. There was one piece of my story still unwritten. I'd kept Landon's father a secret, even from Landon, not because he was shameful, but because he'd asked for privacy. The man I'd loved wasn't a teenage fling. He was a first-year medical resident from Johns Hopkins, working at the clinic where I started. We connected once deeply, but his family didn't approve of me, young, broke, alone. He moved to Boston weeks later. When I told him I was pregnant, he offered money. I refused and never called again. I didn't want Landon to feel like a deal. I wanted him to be mine. 15 years after my parents kicked me out, a letter arrived at my office. My mother's handwriting, shaky, barely legible. "Emma, your cousin said you're nearby. We didn't know how to find you. We'd like to see you and meet your son. Please, if you're open to talking." I sat at my desk, staring at the envelope for an hour. I didn't cry or rage. I just felt something cold, not because they reached out, but because they had no idea what they were walking into. I invited them to my home the next Saturday, but I didn't prepare them. I didn't mention my job, my house, Landon's manners, or the life I'd built with the hands they thought would fail. I wanted them to see it, to walk through the door they'd slammed shut and choke on their regret. They pulled up 10 minutes early. Of course they did. My father, Daniel Carter, was the type who needed to control every second, to arrive rather than be welcomed. Now, 15 years later, he stood on my porch with my mother, both dressed like they were headed to a yacht club, not visiting the daughter they'd disowned. I saw them through the window by the door. My mother clutched her purse, her eyes scanning the garden, the swing, the polished steps. She whispered something to him, maybe a warning, maybe a plea. I opened the door before they knocked. My father froze. My mother's jaw twitched. I'd changed so much it threw them off. I wasn't the scared girl in a hoodie dragging a bag across their lawn. I stood taller, sharper, confident without effort. My cream blouse, black slacks, and the pearl necklace Landon gave me for my last birthday said everything before I spoke. "Emma," my mother whispered, her voice cautious. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They didn't know how to act. The house was warm, elegant, quiet. Light poured through sheer curtains, glowing on hardwood floors and framed photos on the walls. It smelled faintly of coffee and lavender. "Nice place," my father mumbled, but it wasn't praise. It was disbelief. How did she afford this? How did she do this without us? I didn't answer his unspoken question. "Landon's upstairs. He'll be down soon." They stood in my living room, eyes darting like tourists in a gallery, afraid to touch anything too valuable. "We weren't sure you'd reply," I said. My mother looked at me, blinking fast. "We were wrong," she said softly. "We thought we were protecting you. We thought being tough would make you change. We didn't think you'd actually leave." "That was the point," I said, my voice calm but firm. My father shifted, arms crossed. "You were a kid. You had no plan." "I had a child," I cut in, "and a job and a backbone." He looked away. The silence stretched, heavy with 15 years of unspoken words, then footsteps on the stairs. Landon appeared, wearing a neat navy sweater and jeans, hair combed, expression calm and curious. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, kind-eyed. He looked like someone you'd trust, someone raised with unconditional love. Landon, I said, these are your grandparents. He blinked, stepped down, and stood beside me. Hi, he said simply. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father took a half step forward, lips parting. But it wasn't just Landon's resemblance to me that hit them. It was the photos he carried, pulled from a cabinet. He handed one to my mother, a picture of him with a tall man in a white coat. That's my dad, Landon said proudly. He's a heart surgeon in Boston. He visits in the summer and sends me books every month. My mother nearly dropped the photo. Before they could speak, Landon pulled another frame and held it out. It was me standing at a podium with the Harrington Medical logo, surrounded by executives. Mom's head of operations, he said with a small smile. She runs everything. That's when it hit. My father's face collapsed like the air was knocked out of him. He stumbled back, gripping the couch. You, he whispered. You built all this? I met his gaze. My voice was steady, but it carried every sleepless night, every insult, every moment they thought I'd fail. No, I said, I built myself. The room was so still you could hear the breeze against the windows. My father couldn't sit. He was too proud, and his legs seemed too weak to hold what he was seeing. My mother sank onto the couch's edge, still clutching the photo of Landon and his father. Her lips moved, but no words came. Landon stood beside me, calm, unfazed. He knew these people had chosen to be strangers in his life. Now they stood in a home they didn't build, looking at a boy they didn't raise and a woman they'd tried to erase. My father cleared his throat. I didn't know you were in touch with him, the boy's father. I wasn't, I said. Not for years. He wanted to help, but I said no. I wanted Landon to grow up with stability, not broken promises. When he was 10, I let them meet on my terms. My mother's voice shook. He's wonderful, Emma. Thank you, I said softly. She looked at me, tears brimming. We made a mistake. I didn't answer. The words were too late. My father's voice rose, not angry but desperate. You could have called, you could have come back. We would have helped. No, you wouldn't have, I said sharply. You told me to leave. You didn't ask if I had a plan or if I was safe. You assumed I'd fail and made sure I knew I wasn't wanted. My voice cracked, not from weakness but from finality. You threw out your daughter on her worst day. Now you want to sit on my couch and act like it never happened. My mother sobbed. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry for everything. I looked at her. For the first time in 15 years, I felt nothing. Not anger, not hate, just closure. I nodded. I forgave you years ago, I said, but that doesn't mean we go back. My father looked stunned. Emma, this house has no room for shame, Dad. I raised a boy who respects women, who knows love isn't conditional. I became the woman you didn't think I could be. Now you're standing in my home, breathing air I earned, seeing a life I fought for. I turned to Landon. Grab your jacket, buddy. We're going to the bookstore. He nodded and headed upstairs, his steps light. My mother looked up, wiping her eyes. Will we see you again? I paused, then met her gaze. That depends, I said, on whether you want to know your grandson or keep pretending the past didn't happen. I walked them to the door. They stood there, silent, pale, stunned. I didn't hug them. I didn't say goodbye. I just closed the door softly behind them. For the first time in 15 years, I was the one on the inside, standing in a home filled with everything they thought I'd never have.